Throughout its entire history, mankind has witnessed many wars and border changes, the birth of empires, and the rise of dictatorships. But a genocide has always been the most dreadful. It means the deliberate rejection of humanity, the purposeful destruction of people for their beliefs, ethnicity, nationality, or race, and, in fact, the annihilation of people for who they are. The Holodomor became one of the biggest crimes against humanity in world history. As a result of Soviet policy in Ukraine in 1932 to 1933, millions of people were killed. Ukrainians were starved to death for their nationality, language, identity, and their denial to follow that communist totalitarian machine, which forcibly led everyone to their fake bright future of communism through blood and torture. On 30 December 1922, a new state was born that united hundreds of nations and cultures by means of military interventions and revolution: the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. Another name for this union was the Prison of the Nations. Communism became a new policy, the new ideology, religion, and culture of this new state, its past and present. And in the meantime, it became an excuse to kill millions of people. As part of its economic policy, the newly formed state set a course for collectivization. Presented as creating heaven on earth, in reality, it turned into a forced organization of private individual farmers into collective farms owned by the state. In a utopian world, this was meant to become a voluntary surrender of people's own land and cattle. People were supposed to pass all that property on to the state, to work collectively every day, and then to distribute the produce among everyone who was working, according to the level of their contribution. The slogan was, "The one who does not work does not eat." But the real motivation of the Soviet regime was to rob and destroy Ukrainian villages. For farmers, their land and its cultivation were the foundation for their well-being. Their families' prosperity depended on that. To surrender their land was to surrender the confidence in their own future and their identity. This meant giving away everything they earned through their hard work over several decades, giving it away to the state, whose values and ideology were completely alien. And as a reward, people would be allowed to exchange their recorded working days for miserable food rations at the end of each year.
Кожна національна група, вона має свої якісь, відмінності. Українець – це власник. Це власник. От ви розумієте, коли ми говоримо, користуємося сталінськими термінами – куркуль. А куркуль загалом в цьому, якщо подивитися в енциклопедії, куркулем називали шуліку. Тобто нападає, хапає. Так, оце. І вони якраз використали оце, що куркуль – це таке щось таке хиже, паскудне, хапає завжди, грабує і таке все інше. А куркуль – то не куркуль, то селянин-власник.
Nearly 9 out of 10 Ukrainians lived in villages in those days. Most of them owned farms. They were not very enthusiastic about no longer being independent farm workers, but turning into slaves who would be working for food instead. So in the early 1930s, there were over 4,000 protests of Ukrainian farmers against such an initiative from the state. They refused to work for some abstract ideological constructs while their children had nothing to eat. So their individualism and sense of national identity became for the Soviet Union a stumbling block at the gates to its collective heaven. That's why, by 1932, an unrealistic grain procurement plan was set for Ukraine, imposing a quota of 356 million poods of grain. One pood is roughly 16.38 kilograms. This is an equivalent of about 5.8 million metric tons. So you can imagine how unrealistic such an amount was. To officially approve this plan, Stalin's closest associates, Kaganovich and Molotov, arrived in Kharkiv. They were both clearly aware of Stalin's intention to destroy any existing opposition at all costs, especially in Ukraine.
Голодомор в Україні був цивілізаційним винищенням. Просто, умовно кажучи, у Адольфа Гітлера і Йосипа Сталіна були різні цілі. У Адольфа Гітлера була ціль, і була одна з головних його політичних цілей – повне винищення єврейського народу, тому що це було частиною расової ідеології нацизму. А у Йосипа Сталіна була ціль – знищити українців як цивілізаційне явище, щоб більше ніколи український народ не мав можливості претендувати на свою самостійну роль в історії, самостійну роль в цивілізації. Тому що російські шовіністи, до яких по суті своїй належав Сталін, хоча він і був більшовиком, просто були в шоці від того, що відбувалося на українських землях 1917-1920-х років, та й після того, коли навіть в умовах окупованої радянської України продовжувалися розмови про самостійність в партійно-господарській еліті, і з іншого боку продовжувалося селянське повстання і опір колективізації. І ось стало ясно, Сталін був з цієї точки зору великим фахівцем, що якщо ти знищуєш українське село, фізично знищуєш, ти таким чином унеможливлюєш подальший розвиток українського народу.
After the first waves of collectivization, farmers began to oppose it en masse. They were leaving collective farms, kolhosps, taking back their inventory, cattle, and grain. On 7 August 1932, the resolution on safekeeping the property of state enterprises, collective farms, and cooperatives, and strengthening public socialist property was enacted. This document was better known as the Law of 5 Years of Grain. For the theft of any collective farm property, the offenders could be executed by shooting. Should they have any extenuating circumstances, they could get away with imprisonment for at least 10 years. According to the Law of 5 Years of Grain, people were not allowed to collect even crop residues. During that time, special patrol brigades went from house to house in a village to confiscate all grain people had. Molotov's enthusiasm had no limits. By 18 November 1932, he introduced blacklists, so-called black boards. If a village entered such a list, it would become surrounded by the army units, blocking entry into or exit from the village, taking away all essential goods from shops such as salt, matches, paraffin, and confiscating any food. In other words, it was a siege in which people would slowly starve to death. The only territories where such a regime was introduced were Ukraine and Kuban, the territories mostly populated by Ukrainians. The resolution of the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party, Bolsheviks, and the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR, signed by Stalin and Molotov, isolated Ukrainians by preventing them from leaving the Ukrainian SSR and Kuban to get any grain. During the spring and early summer of 1933, the highest rates of mortality were observed among the local population. Nothing like this was done to any other administrative region or Soviet republic.
Зловісній постанові ЦК ВКПБ і Раднаркому СРСР від 14 грудня 1932 року, підписану Сталіним і Молотовим, який називається «Про хлібозаготівлю на Україні, Північному Кавказі і в Західній області», тобто на Смоленщині тодішній, які причини невиконання Смоленщиною хлібозаготівель не згадуються. І які покарання для Смоленщини за невиконання хлібозаготівель також нема в тому документі. Але в тому документі причинами називаються головним чином петлюрівські елементи, які пролізли в правління колгоспів, там за складом і так далі. Не тільки, власне, в Україні, але й на Кубані. І от покарання за невиконання хлібозаготівель для Смоленщини нема ніякого. Але для районів України і Північного Кавказу, тобто для Кубані, там дуже чітко все визначено. І найперше, що треба судити, там, скажімо, в Україні показово кількох секретарів і райкомів партії, голів райвиконкомів, дати їм по 5-10 років. І що важливо, згорнути українізацію.
To cover the mass mortality, Stalin deliberately manipulated the statistics. The world was presented with data demonstrating high birth rates in the USSR in the early 1930s, whereas any facts about the catastrophic reduction of the population in the Ukrainian SSR were concealed. Those who survived kept quiet for many decades. Otherwise, they would risk their own safety and the safety of their families and friends. The Soviet rule triumphed. The resistance of the population was broken down by destroying anyone who had stood against. Any survivors were intimidated, and they remembered well what could happen to those who opposed. They learned that no weapon was needed to kill. The famine alone was enough. Many more years had passed before one of the biggest crimes against humanity became revealed to the world. By 2020, 17 countries recognized the Holodomor as a form of genocide. Ukraine was among them, who had already done so in 2006. For Ukraine, that meant deep rethinking of the country's past, evaluation of the tragedy's impact on the country's present, and definition of the course for future development. The Holodomor taught humanity the high price for silent inaction in the face of a global crime.